Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Vanessa Beeley, and I would honored to point out that she is not, if not the most, one of the most recurring guests on this platform. I was looking back at how many times we've spoken with her, and I think it just speaks to the amazing wealth of knowledge that she brings to the table. And today, discussing Syria in particular, with I hope many of you have seen the interesting series of events and the mixed information flying around online about what's going on there. And so I wanted to invite her on to discuss about what's going on in Syria, how this relates to the larger conversation, somebody who's actually broadcasting at the moment from Syria, and in my opinion is, if not one of the best voices to discuss, to speak to, I should say, around this topic. And if you have not looked into her information, her work going back decades, I highly recommend you do. So Vanessa, how are you today? Thank you for joining me.
Decades, Ryan. I think you've just aged me about.
Well, you've done so much. You've done so much amazing work on this and many other topics for such a long time. I just think that's important to point out.
Yeah.
And again, I thought I was really, the reason I noted that is I was looking back before we got started today. I was like, wow, I think you one of the more than anybody else, other than maybe a couple, if not I didn't get to go through everything, but we've had you on more than just about anybody. And it's interesting because so much does swirl around not just the Syria topic, but a lot of what we've discussed over the years, even current, domestic policy, it seems in a lot of ways. So let's get into that in general around Syria itself and what's going on there. So let's start with, what's the general story, because here's what people are seeing that, just don't look at anything other than the corporate media, right? Syrian rebels enter Alepo for the first time, and the story becoming this kind of invasion conversation, a coup, occupation. So let's start with that in general and let people know what's really going on, because even myself, I'm trying to get caught up with how much is going on in the world.
Yeah, I mean, what has been going on for the last, 3 or 4 days, they've kind of all become the same. None of us have really had much sleep here. Has been really a very well organized psychological warfare operation with some elements of truth, but what has effectively happened is there's been massive amplification of certain elements of the story. And I do have to say, why was it successful? Because even people in Syria were panicking. When the images that were being generated allegedly inside Aleppo were actually reaching people in Homs, in Hamas, or in all areas of Syria, including Damascus, everyone was freaking out. Aleppo has fallen again, because of course this is to a degree also playing on the repetition of history, what happened in 2012 when the Turkish proxy armed groups entered eastern Aleppo, invaded and took over, and then for the next 4 years incarcerated the Syrian civilians in districts surrounding Aleppo, not in central Aleppo, or what was called then Western Aleppo. That was still under the government protection, and that's where the majority of civilians were living. Of course, Western media didn't give you that side of the story. They just told you that all Aleppo was being besieged and starved and so on and so forth. And so I'll try to condense it. It is pretty complicated what actually went on, but I think what's probably better is to look at how the army is now managing it, because this is kind of what is going to give the key to what is going on. Because when suddenly we started to see all these images of the terrorists inside the city and taking selfies in front of certain artifacts and buildings and institutions, what it reminded me of almost immediately were the white helmet propaganda stills and movies and so on, because it was the same 2 or 3 people in each photo. I think there was only one photo that had about 10 people in it, or 10 or 11 outside the citadel. So I was like, okay, this isn't a mass invasion, right?
Right.
So what we then ascertained was that there were sleeper cells, remnants of the terrorist groups left behind in Aleppo. They were basically triggered to emerge and to start taking photographs in front of all of these buildings and famous places inside Aleppo. Then we found out that there had been either a security breach or, which again is very possible, this has happened on a number of occasions during the war in Syria. There are kind of rookie soldiers who collapsed. Their line collapsed at a certain point when they saw some of the armed groups coming towards them, and there was a breach, right? People need to understand this is a war. We talk about the fog of war, but it's very true. I think no one will actually know exactly what happens until months or years afterwards. Will they be able to absolutely kind of, disentangle everything that went on? And at that point, the armed forces took the decision to evacuate everyone from Aleppo. Why? Because the primary targets would be the security forces, the police, the army, government officials, people who were loyal to the government, and so on and so forth, or Shia and Alawite communities inside Aleppo. So they were immediately evacuated. And of course, this had the effect of panicking everyone again, because suddenly there's no army, there's no security forces, and these images of armed groups kind of marauding around and tearing posters down and firing their machine guns. But I think this was part of a bigger strategy, because by doing this, they reduced the number of clashes between the security forces, the police, and so on.
Right.
And the small number of armed group members that entered Aleppo. So in a sense, they protected the civilians by doing this, although it seemed like the reverse.
And as you say, minimized what would appear to be a larger psyop if they had let that clash look a lot larger. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you saw, for example, terrorists entering hospitals or entering government buildings, they were kind of acting out, because the person that was welcoming them at the desk and making it look like, oh, brother, you've come back to liberate us, this was actually one of them.
Right.
It wasn't any of the actual government officials there. And then basically what happened is the army withdrew. Now, as soon as this happens, my brain starts thinking, okay, this is a trap. Because if you're allowing these armed groups to come forward, and you're withdrawing out, what happens? You create an area in which you've surrounded them. Right? And not only this, when you consider that they're coming from Idlib, Idlib is under the ceasefire agreement from 2020 between Ankara and Moscow. And so, therefore, it's kind of hands-off Idlib. It's hands off the terrorists in Idlib, despite the fact that Ukraine and Turkey are arming and equipping them and building up their numbers precisely for this attack. But by drawing the terrorists up, and we'll get on to where they are now and how they've advanced and how the army has again now encircled them and so on.
Okay, before we get into the next start, there's a lot of things I want to flesh out for people. So what we're talking about is, so to be clear, which I think is clear what you already said, but so we're talking about an actual force that did go in. And
we're already in there. That's important.
Yeah, right. So there were kind of sleeper cell elements that were left behind. And I would state my own opinion that I think it's obvious. It's very clear why Syrians would fall for this, or that the government would be very, very cautious, because they have carried out gas attacks and false flags and all sorts of stuff in the past. So then they kind of pull back and allow them to allow that to minimize what the clash there may be, right? So now they've kind of let them, and that's where they're getting the photos from of them invading, looking like they're taking over these buildings. And so at that point, in your mind and what you've seen thus far, where is that coming from? And maybe this is more to get into after you describe the next part, but what's driving this action in your mind, or do you have evidence to back up who might be pulling their strings?
Pulling their strings?
The sleeper cell
terrorist
elements. Why did this start happening now?
This also, for me, is very obvious, because the attack came literally hours after the ceasefire between Netanyahu and Lebanon. Right, literally hours.
And of course, the land bridge dynamic and the supply lines. This is Syria and both Al-Tamp and the other, very important to this, right? There's
two things at play here. First of all, there's Israel, And of course, Israel has historically funded and armed the terrorist groups. It's provided medical treatment. It's provided artillery cover for them, particularly in the south. It's weaponized them, and it's also provided air support effectively. Because, for example, when the Syrian Arab Army about 10 days ago was fighting ISIS in the central desert area, when they returned to the headquarters to rest, basically, after the battles, Israel, from the American military base on the border with Jordan, Al Tanif, fired missiles into Palmyra, where the headquarters were, and killed, I think it was around 90 of kind of Syrian and allied forces that had been the day before fighting ISIS. And we've seen multiple times that Israel is basically providing air support and coordination for previous terrorist offensives, particularly from the northwest. But also from Turkey's perspective, because Turkey has, if you like, I mean, it's basically occupied much of the northern territory of Syria. It is working with and collaborating with Mohammed al-Julani, who's the head of now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but it's effectively Ultra Front or Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And for Turkey, of course, Turkey's ambitions were always, that's why it was their brigades, Turkish-backed brigades, that invaded Aleppo in 2012. The neo-Ottoman ambitions of Erdogan have been to take control of Aleppo and the entire northern strip of Syria under the pretext to provide a buffer zone against what they call the Kurdish terrorists that are also weaponized by the US in the US and Israel in the northeast of Syria to occupy oil resources, ethnically cleanse the area of Syrians, and steal agricultural resources also.
So really quick on that point, and I do want to come back to the next stage in this, but that's fascinating to me. So how do you see this whole trifecta, what do you want to call it, this triangle of, so you have Turkey, who's a NATO ally, right, who is a threat in the Kurd dynamic, and the US backs this element, but then you currently have Kurds in conversations with Israel about deals with that side of it against Israel in certain ways. So how do you see that playing out? Are they, go ahead, I'll let you fill in the
Well,
blank.
I mean, this kind of gets even more complicated and, let's say, more interesting. Because actually, so if we imagine the army has withdrawn to a kind of peripheral circle around not even the outskirts of Aleppo, but beyond the outskirts of Aleppo. So that left the outskirts of Aleppo and certain strategic areas in Aleppo, like all of the northeast, the north, up to Tal Rifat, which is, people probably won't know where that is, but it's I think about 12 kilometers from the Turkish border. And it's always been a target for Erdogan to take control of, so that he can break the connection for the Kurds from the east to the west. Because where it's positioned, it's the main road from the northeast to the northwest, and the Kurds want control of it because then they can actually unify their strip from the northeast to the northwest. And of course,
everyone's trying to get their cut of Syria, it seems.
Yeah, I know. But what actually happened, so after the Syrian army withdrew, it became apparent that there must have been discussions between Damascus and the Kurds. And the Kurds took control of the areas where the Syrian army withdrew, but they took control under the command of the Syrian army. So this is where it gets it's not confusing, but it will be for the audience, because it's such a sort of complex, kind of intricate political game that's going on, really. So that, just to quickly explain that, why the Kurds would agree to that, because the Kurds' nemesis is Turkey, and it's currently Turkish-backed proxy forces from inside Idlib, but also from the north, the Syrian National Army. They've been rebranded. It was the Free Syrian Army, which were the Muslim Brotherhood that collaborated with Al-Qaeda in the beginning, right, and ISIS. So the Kurds, the one faction that they will always fight, not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, but is Turkey. because they know that Turkey wants to effectively annihilate them in Syria and also preferably in Turkey. Right? So that is why I think there was a deal done with Damascus that the Kurds would come in and would try and hold the. They're not actually doing a very good job, to be honest. They're collapsing in the north and in the northeast. So there was, in my opinion, there was a lot of negotiation went on before this attack took place. And we knew it was going to happen. I remember talking to the National Defense Forces in northern Hama, which is kind of on the border with Idlib, southern Idlib. And they told me around a month ago, yes, this is going to happen. We know, we have intelligence. And I think Jolani even said he was going to attack, and then he cancelled. Now, why did he cancel? And let's look at the timing of the ceasefire, right? It's basically, so it's effectively 60 days initially, and then on the basis that it might become a permanent ceasefire, which we all know it is, it's not going to happen.
They're already violating it 55 ways.
Yeah. But unfortunately, I think Hezbollah was very much cornered into accepting the ceasefire because of the threat of the ignition of internal divisions inside Lebanon. And so they had a responsibility to try and repair the integrity of Lebanon itself, right? Because Israel, it knew what it was doing. It started bombing in the center of Beirut. It started hitting Christian areas, which of course would ignite the Christian Zionist factions in Lebanon to be turned against Hezbollah. We saw this happening. And the US control, of course, over Lebanon. So the US and Israel were engineering this ceasefire. And I said right from the beginning, this is because they want to pivot to Syria. So what they want to do is to achieve at least a temporary pause. And in that temporary pause, they want to destroy all of the supply lines to Hezbollah. So Hezbollah doesn't have the opportunity to rearm and resupply. And of course, Syria is the land bridge from Iran and Iraq, but it's also one of the main manufacturers. A lot of people don't know this. It's one of the main weapons manufacturers for the resistance factions, both Palestine and Lebanon. So they want to destroy also the manufacturing centers, the scientific research centers, the development centers, like they've been targeting even in the last few months, Mesyaf, which is kind of close to Homs and Hama. I kind of wish we had a map, because then people could kind of get an idea of what this all means. But basically, these areas are relatively close to the border with Lebanon. And in a sense, if you look at where the terrorists have gone, so from Alepo, they've come down towards northern Hama. And there, basically, I think the army has sent in massive reinforcements, and they're basically encouraging them into a basin, which has very little cover. It's flat. The Al Gab plain is very, very flat. It's an agricultural area.
So this might help.
Yes.
I'll try to move this over. There we go.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
So just if you want to just kind of, I'll direct me. I can point it out. It might be a little difficult for me, but go ahead.
Yeah, so if you go to Homs, which is kind of in the middle, if you go to Lebanon and then northeast.
I'm losing this. There we go. Losing the border. There we go. Okay, Homs right here.
Okay, so you've got Homs, and then go up, you've got Hama. Okay, so that's basically pretty much north of Hama city, kind of in an arc, or where the terrorists are now being contained. Okay. So they've come from Alepo, if you can go north of Hama. Yeah.
Am I missing it?
What's it called?
It's not showing up. I imagine these maps aren't very good from Western satellite systems.
No, Alepo should be there.
I would agree. I'm not seeing it though. Here, let's do this.
Oh, hang on, maybe.
There we go.
Because I just think it helps people to understand when they can actually kind of see.
There's
okay, so Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird. That wasn't being shown before, right? I
Oh,
wasn't
there you
seeing it,
go.
but it's right
So
there
you
now.
can see how far and how fast they've traveled, right?
Mhm.
So they're now to between Hama and the border of Idlib, southern Idlib. And you can
reference,
see Al Skalbiya if you just go up from Hama to the northwest, Al Sukalbiya there. So they're just north of there, pretty much. I mean, they're kind of spread out, but the army has sent
right there.
massive reinforcements to all of that area.
And for reference, here's Lebanon just to the south,
Yeah.
for people to see, you know, kind of the, there's Israel, you know, this, or Palestine.
Yeah.
So,
and if you go from Homs, for example, and go down, you can see how close it is to the Lebanon border. So it goes south. Yeah.
Yes, Homs.
Right. So it's very close.
Mm-hmm.
And the Research and Development Center and all of the supply lines are kind of in that area, in the Qusayr, Homs area. So it's an important area for Israel to have control of. That's the point.
And so, and this would be all Tom right here generally, right? This kind of, this land.
Yeah,
right
on the
there.
border with Jordan.
Yeah, right.
No,
and then
down more. And
it's not showing it. I was
anyway,
somewhere right along here. The point is that they're the one here and then the one over here are the two primary, you know, points. So just for people to understand.
To give you an idea, America has, I think, predominantly in the northeast, around 28 military bases, unlawful military bases. Tanaf is the biggest one on the border with Jordan and Iraq. It's kind of in the triangle of Jordan and Iraq. Turkey has 150 unlawful military bases inside the north and the northwest of Syria. And we're still counting, actually. We're still trying to identify them. The Russian bases are generally Russian-Syrian bases. So even though you will see like a markation of a Russian base, it's usually a joint base, as is the air defenses. Like when people speak about Russia not supplying air defense and so on, the fact is that Russia is usually involved in the air defense in some way or another. Right?
So really quickly on the Kurd point, I find it interesting, and then I want to ask you about where you think why this is happening. But the Kurd point is, so it seems very interesting to me, especially that you're pointing out that the Kurds are dealing to some degree with Syria, that they seem to be kind of this central player in all of this, whoever can get them to so essentially Syria getting them to effectively not push back against them, would that effectively stop a lot of the efforts from at least the U.S. occupation element? Like, isn't that they're one of the main players they use to kind of facilitate that, correct? That are inside Syria?
One of the signals of the Kurds negotiating with Damascus is that they think the U.S. is going to abandon them.
Right, because they have many times, right? So,
and of course, they've been speaking about that under Trump, because Trump actually wasn't, at least in his rhetoric, he wasn't very fond of the Kurds. It's Israel that actually needs the Kurds more than America.
Interesting.
Right? Because America can occupy the oil by itself. But if you imagine for the map of Greater Israel, there's a northeastern section in Syria that is not part of Greater Israel. So why does Israel want the Kurds there? Because they're a useful settlement tool for Israel to keep control of that northeastern sector that at the moment isn't part of Greater Israel. So that's why, for me, the Kurds are a bigger instrument for Israel, in a sense, than for the US. The US, even before the Kurds were being used, were using ISIS to steal Syrian oil.
Right.
They have enough proxies that they can organize to fund themselves by stealing Syrian oil and taking it into Iraqi Kurdistan and then selling it wherever they want. It's not.
The proxy point's important too, just to show how many different, manipulative groups they're out there that they're funding. Usually the most radical elements out there in the world. But so do you think this is more distractionary from what's going on in other fields, like with the Lebanon, Palestine, or is it about, you're talking about cutting off the supply lines for the war?
No.
How do you see this? What's the main purpose of this in your mind?
The main purpose, as I said, if you look at where the terrorists are trying to go, right? They're trying to go to an area that is beneficial to Israel.
Okay.
Because if they made it beyond Hama, you can imagine they would get to Homs, they might get to Masyaf, to the biggest, I think, research and development center that Israel is constantly trying to destroy, right?
Interesting.
And take control of the main supply routes to Hezbollah.
Right.
And the area of Qusayr, which is traditionally a kind of a Hezbollah stronghold.
So
I can't remember when the big battles for it were, back in 2013, I think.
So a perfect end game would be for them to officially occupy and take control of all of Syria, but if not, destroy these necessary locations to help themselves in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. Not necessarily all of Syria. Of course, the other purpose they could be serving is to provide a distraction which diverts all the majority of the Syrian forces to the north and the northwest, while Israel prepares for some kind of operation in the south.
Right. And let me bring that map back up again, because it's important to note that Syria is part of the greater Israel dynamic. I mean, most of Syria, right? So it's same with Lebanon, same all these locations. So it's not just these are coincidentally what they're holding to stop the war. It's ultimately this is a guise, at least in one case, to take. I mean, like to point out in Lebanon, for example, they already have released maps with Hebrew names of the settlements they want to put in northern Lebanon. You know, so this is very, very on the surface. So
well, and historically, they've always believed that south of the Litani River is their territory. I mean, there's been, I think there was one article in the Jerusalem Post that they quickly deleted. Maybe it wasn't the right time to publish it, where from a religious perspective, they argued that southern Lebanon is theirs. It's Israeli territory from, you know, from a religious historical perspective, blah, blah, blah. And now, of course, through the ceasefire, the difficulty is now is they've advanced way further than they did during the actual battles with Hezbollah, and they didn't really advance. I mean, absolutely minimal amount of territory was taken by Israel during the 1 month or whatever it was, 56 days or something, of the battles between Hezbollah and Israel on the ground. But now, because the Lebanese army, which is it's fully sponsored by the United States, and the United States has deliberately kept it incapable of defending itself against Israel, because they're supplying billions of dollars worth of weapons and equipment and, you know, sophisticated warplanes and missiles and so on to Israel, and to the Lebanese army. I think they gave them 2 reconditioned Cessna planes that can fire Hellfire missiles, but that's it, right? So that's just to give you an idea of the kind of disproportionate sponsorship of the US, of Lebanese army, and of the Israeli army. The Lebanese army is incapable of defending itself.
And that's despite the fact that Israel has been targeting them, whether accidentally or not, more than once. Not Hezbollah, but the actual Lebanese forces, which is interesting, you know. But so let's bring this back to the part that, so we basically, they had pulled back, right? This is the recent iteration of this. In sleeper cell elements took pictures and it made, you know, sold the narrative that they were taking over everything. So that's where we kind of left off. And you had posted some stuff kind of trying to walk people back from the edge, you know, saying the video, you know, what we just discussed essentially in this tweet. And then you were highlighting what kind of the aftermath was. So go into that for me in regard to what happened with the Hayat al-Sham elements and the reaction of the government, and kind of the reality that there is no coup going on despite all the narrative. And we can touch on the kind of social media misinformation campaign.
It was just unbelievable. I mean, last night there was what was it? 2 divisions basically of the Syrian Arab army were allegedly fighting it out in the center of Damascus. And there were people.
There's no truth to this at all.
No, absolutely not. There's nothing that would never happen within the Syrian army, you know. And tonight we were just talking about it before I came on. Apparently, Syrian rebels have stormed the presidential palace in Damascus. So my answer was, really, as the Iranian foreign minister suddenly joined the rebels, because he's in the palace with the president. So I have no idea what you're talking. And that was Jerusalem Post.
Right.
That's a fairly kind of well-established media outlet. You know, it's not some social media idiot that's just putting this stuff out
Which
there.
is part of it too. But so are we?
Well,
Are we
yeah.
talking about videos, or are these just like written narratives that are being shared? You know, so are they like manufacturing fake videos?
Well, tonight that was a written narrative, but for example, they managed to take the video of all the Syrian army tanks and armored cars arriving in Hama, and they flipped it to make it look like they were heading south, and then dubbed in someone going, "Oh, wow," not even in a Syrian accent, I don't think, or you know, Syrian Arab accent, saying it was the terrorists heading for Homs.
Sounds very much like Zionist level propaganda that we've seen over the last year.
Flimsy. I mean, you know, it's no different to COVID, is it?
Right.
You know, suddenly everyone's terrified of a virus. It's the same thing. It's the same manipulation, mind manipulation. And, you know, unfortunately, many Syrians, they've lived through 14 years of war. To suddenly see that Alepo, the city that was liberated in 2016, and the countryside was liberated, I think, 2020, it was fully liberated, had fallen in like what appeared to be minutes. I mean, it was, I can honestly say people were calling me crying. It was horrible. It was really horrible to see people being absolutely messed with psychologically in that way after everything that they've gone through. That is actually pure evil in my opinion, you know.
I agree.
It was awful and shocking, and it was really difficult to even deal with. And I don't mean that from my perspective, but it was just you know, horrible for them. So what's happening now is sorry, because you asked me. So the armed groups basically are mostly on the kind of outskirts of Aleppo, inside the city, but on the very furthest suburbs.
Out the armed groups being the Syrian forces, or the
no, sorry, the terrorists.
Okay,
terrorists.
got
it. So what's happening now is Russia and Syria are bombing. Like, the civilians have had instructions to basically stay away from large gatherings of Nusra Front, or whatever you want to call them, Al-Qaeda. Let's call them that, because that's what they are basically. And mostly foreign mercenaries, you know, Uzbeks, Uyghurs, Albanians. Less than 50%, I think, is Syrian, to be quite honest. And of course, Ukraine also has.
You're framing them as resistance forces from within Syria fighting for freedom, right? That's kind of the usual frame.
Yeah.
So just make clear, that's why she's pointing that out, that these are foreign entities, in the framing from like the U.S. Western narrative is usually that they're Syrians fighting for freedom for their government or for their country, which is obviously not the case. So I just want to point that out. Go ahead.
No, I mean, they're foreign mercenaries from multiple countries. Of course, the Uyghurs from China, Chechens, Uzbeks, Afghanis, all of them belonging to extremist fanatic sects. There are actually even Salafist Kurds in the northwest. So, as I said, this, you know, when you go into it in depth, it just becomes insane.
Right.
But Ukrainian military, special forces, and intelligence have also been in the northwest training the armed groups for some time, on the basis that it was negotiated with Giuliani that they would come and they would provide training and weapons in return for Giuliani choosing which of his terrorists he would send to fight in Ukraine against Russia. And we know already that we've seen the ISIS patches in Ukraine.
And also now again in Syria as well, right? We're seeing that same thing, the forces they're sending, and it's being denied. It's
exactly. So basically, those large gatherings are getting bombed, and they are getting obliterated, right? Because we come back to this ceasefire agreement from 2020 between Moscow and Ankara, which meant that effectively Idlib was a protected area north of one of the main roads from Aleppo to Latakia on the eastern coast of Syria. North of that line was a kind of protected area occupied by Turkey, patrolled, the road itself was patrolled or should be patrolled by Russia and Turkey. Of course, there have been ceasefire violations, but, you know, Russia has respected the ceasefire, not always in agreement with Damascus for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But now what has happened, one, thanks to kind of Turkey's precipitous attack, and Israel pushing them to attack, of course, they've massively broken the ceasefire. So that should be null and void, should be. We'll see what political shenanigans go on over that. But ultimately, of course, what's happened is huge numbers of the terrorists have left Idlib. And the more they're drawn out, they're legitimate targets.
Yeah. Well, and that's a positive in the end game for possibly retaking Syrian territory, right? Is because I think, well, I guess obviously the state forces that are keeping that occupation going would be the main point, but I think the terrorist forces being gone is an obvious positive, right?
Yeah, and of course that also then someone described it very well. They said Netanyahu's thrown a boomerang to Netanyahu. Sorry, Erdogan has thrown a boomerang to Netanyahu. Let's hope it comes back and cuts off his head. And the point is, it probably will, because look, where will those terrorists go? They will go to Turkey. Suddenly Turkey will be inundated with all of these terrorist groups that he's managed to contain in Syria and kind of feed them, you know, give them electricity and water there, but they're in Syria. They're not a threat to Turkey itself. Secondly, what was I going to say? The fact that they've exited Idlib, the fact that Turkey has actually triggered his own proxies, Erdogan's own proxies from the north, the Syrian National Army, to get involved. So in a sense, that there's a two-prong attack going on from the north and from the northwest. This has completely exposed Erdogan.
Right.
And you know what it does, in a sense, I think he was doing this to, one, remind everyone that he's here, because there's deals going on kind of all over the place, and Turkey is very much getting left out on a limb, both with the US and with Russia and even with Israel. Because if you look at the India, Middle East economic corridor, there's no Turkey involved in that.
Well,
so,
go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Well, I was just going to say this is, again, the same point from the Turkey elements always stood out to me as such an interesting anomaly as a NATO ally, yet seemingly kind of never really like they just kind of act their own way and do their own thing, you know. And so in this case, how do you see the like with what you just described, and then the weird, at least forward-facing resistance to Israel in a lot of ways that I mean, he's even come out and called it genocide. So so if it seems that they're actively kind of on the same side with this, whether that's by design or not, how do you see that fitting in? Is there more connection betwing Erdogan and
yeah, absolutely. They're two peas in a pod.
That's important.
But the thing is, they have their own agendas as regards hegemony and empire. Right. So in some ways they're rivals, in other ways they're allies. And even while Erdogan has been putting out all of this rhetoric and claiming that he's stopped trading with Israel and so on, he hasn't. He's continued supplying oil from Baku in Azerbaijan. He's supplying materials for weapons manufacturer, steel, and so on. And he just diverts it. He diverts it through, you know, NGOs in the occupied Cyprus territories or whatever. But he's never stopped. And what's happening now, he's working hand in glove with Israel. It's a pincer action, potentially, because if Turkey is coming from the north and the terrorists are heading north to south, that leaves the terrain open for Israel potentially to take territory in the south. Either through proxies, because of course Israel's behind the separatist movements in Sweda in the southeast, and also has control to some degree over the terrorist factions that remained in Dara, south of Damascus, and so on, right? So, you know, Syria is fighting right now a pretty major war again, but Iraq is mobilizing forces. I think it's probably going to be the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and some of the resistance factions, I think, to come into Syria.
So we can imagine that this is going to immediately become the Iran dictating the entire thing narrative from Israel and the United States with the PMU overlap, which is usually what they go with.
Yeah.
So that immediately justifies, you know, I'm just guessing, in my opinion, obviously, where this goes next, where it'll be that now this is the multi-front war, you know, which they've already kind of included Syria in, which will just justify. I mean, how long until we start seeing the tunnels under homes and human shield narrative shuffled over to Syria, you know? And I think that's where this seems to go. Is that a fair statement?
No, it's absolutely correct. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, after the first 2 days, I just sat down with a couple of people that I, you know, usually brainstorm with, and we were all kind of, you know, how do we make sense of all of this, everything that's going on?
Well, I just don't think it makes sense in the strategic way either. I mean, other than the obvious shutting off the supply lines, it seems like a desperate flailing act, because at this point, even if they succeed in all of these actions, how do they ultimately come out of this? You know, it's like they're trying to dig their way out of a hole with the genocide revelate. People are aware of what's going on. The Western politicians, the media, they're just falling apart with all this right now. So it just seems like a rash decision to just lurch into some new, you know, even though it hasn't really stopped, as I'm sure you'd point out, but I don't know. I mean, I just don't see how this plays out other than that. How do you fit that together?
I mean, for me, it's quite interesting because I sort of try to stay off X and social media because it does my head in. But what I am seeing is most of the kind of what I say pro, you know, regime change idiots are coming back out of the woodwork. But they're getting slammed.
Good.
What I'm seeing is really the reaction is like, what are you talking about? So it's not working. It's not working like it did when people were kind of really didn't have enough information and they were being confused and gaslighted by the narratives about Assad barrel bombing everyone and gassing his own people and so on, right?
Yeah.
But so they're basically re-rolling out the carpet, the regime change carpet, but it's not working.
Yeah, I'm glad to see. I understand why too. I mean, this is why I see a lot of this going on, is that I think they just have lost control over these narratives, and I think this is that's why my point about the desperate kind of reaction. You know, so we have the action of Russian and Syrian forces against the people on the ground. So before we move past that, where is that at currently? Are these forces now destroyed and this is over, or where is this going from today forward?
I mean, this will take time. So basically, again, if you imagine the advance of the terrorist forces, the army moved back to within a certain perimeter around Alepo. So the area in which really the terrorist groups can operate, there's not enough of them inside Aleppo to occupy the city, by the way. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever they say, there's just scatterings of them. They can't set up any kind of military occupation at the moment. Okay. But the ones that are kind of stuck between Aleppo and the Syrian army positions are getting heavily bombed. And remember that, for example, some of the towns within that perimeter also have been fully evacuated. That was really the biggest number of people that you saw evacuating from Aleppo city. So it wasn't, you know, some people were saying huge numbers of people had left Aleppo, but actually the majority were from the Shia Muslim towns, Nubal and Zara, in that area that had faced massacre by the terrorist groups back in 2016, I think it was. And so within that perimeter, they're getting pulverized. And then what's happening is Russia is bombing all of the supply lines to them. So it's bombing behind the Syrian army positions to the south and to the east of Idlib city. And it has been attacking Idlib city itself, which is, of course, their headquarters. There were reports that Jolani had been killed in an attack on the command headquarters, but we don't know if that has been confirmed.
Yeah, well, that's what I was gonna say. You had said this was an AI image, but we don't. Is that so? The actual confirmation is not in yet, but this is confirmed to be a fake image that was circulating.
Yeah, a number of Syrians told me it was fake. So I think there's high potential that it is. I can't say really one way or another, but people are saying, look, it's not confirmed. I wouldn't sort of use this image as evidence, and so that's fair enough. We'll wait to see. The proof will be, is he going to appear again as he did in one of the videos showing him getting out of his car in Aleppo city, which I think wasn't Aleppo city, but
usually how that goes.
So basically what Russia's now doing is bombing the supply lines, the support system behind those supply lines, and the drone manufacturing sites, the ammunition, and so on. And that will be ongoing. But what people also need to understand is that a lot of this is underground. So it's
are we getting the same claims? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. Sorry.
Sorry, I want to ask about, are we getting the same claims of, Russia bombing civilians in Idlib like we were seeing last time? Is that actually happening again?
Yeah, I'm sure the white helmets are on high alert right now to roll out all of their.
It's funny you bring that up, because even Patrick Henningsen was doing the same thing. Hey, look who's popped out of the shadows again. Even though they weren't around for the longest time. And I'll include one of your discussions as well. By the way, I'll grab the 5 different times we've talked about this on our platform around white helmets and the different lies around that.
Yeah. So basically that's it. And Russia has, I think in the last 72 hours, they've been sending weapon systems into Syria. They've changed the head of the Russian forces back to who was here before, I think in the kind of, I'm trying to think, around 2020. So he was involved in some of the kind of toughest battles actually to liberate northern Hama and southern Idlib. That's Commander, or I assume it's General Shaiko. So he's come back. He's been reappointed to Syria. So they're obviously, this kind of means business from Russia's perspective. And I'm personally quite sure that Putin and Trump will already be talking. And, I think we agree, you and I, that realpolitik is that's what it's about. It's just about dealing and kind of, reaching a satisfying agreement between enemies, basically, at the end of the day. And so I think the deal that might be on the table is to do with Ukraine. I mean, obviously, Trump got elected on he's going to resolve Ukraine. And I think, we all knew that Zelensky at some point was going to be thrown under the bus. And by the way, I am not going to give any credit to Trump, because I just see it as a tag team. Biden did his bit. Trump's now going to come in and manage the next section of the roadmap. And that's it. That's how I look at it. So there's no way that I'm going to be accused of being a Trump supporter or Trump's bringing peace or anything like that. It's just, this is the next part of the game. Right.
I wholehearteatly agree with that, but I'm sure we both would agree that regardless of who and how, if it did come to an end, even if used for another lie later, it would still be a good thing, right? So we're both, I have a hard time with people out there that would not want this to stop because that would look good for Trump. I mean, those people don't care about positive outcomes.
That's
I know
not
we
my
agree
point.
on that. No, I know. Yeah.
But then you mentioned Georgia, because I find it interesting that the whole Georgia thing now is kicking off just as maybe Ukraine will get settled down. Right. And maybe there will be some agreement on Trump withdrawing from the northeast of Syria, but not from Al Tanif. That would be my reading of that, because Israel isn't going to allow the US to step out completely. Right. But it's interesting for me that suddenly Georgia is kicking off again, because historically Georgia has been weaponized against Russia. So the fact that is that to put pressure on Russia to make a deal about Syria and Ukraine, maybe.
Well, I'm also worried about the possibility and the idea that it's hard to see, who to know, how to know what. It's hard to tell what player is making what move and how this all plays out, right? So, like, to me,
Yeah.
from the Syria side of it, I think it's obvious that this is more so the interest of Israel and what in the end game. And hopefully, on a side note, that this may be inadvertently lead to the end of that occupation because of how belligerent these moves are. That might be a good thing, even though it's causing, killing. But then at the same time, like with Georgia, it might even strike me as it makes sense more so that this might be a U.S. move to maintain something that is in their benefit, or like as opposed
That's
to.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And so, like,
that's what I mean. So it's, in a sense, it's like, okay, we'll do a deal on Ukraine, but just in case you get complacent, we might kick something off in Georgia.
Right, but what I mean is almost to the detriment to Israel's agenda. Like, see, I'm saying, like, because there might be, that's just my thought that might be playing out. But so I guess the point would be we should always consider that there's multiple players in these things.
And
either way, it's interesting that Georgia is spinning off, and like somebody made the joke about Newland packages coming in. Here's cookies and a gas mask, and it just was so strange, And so the worry is that there's another thing, there's the fake color revolution, kind of pro-democracy protest popping off again. So do you think that is one and the same? Is this part of your opinion? This is part of the same kind of distraction area or destabilization?
Well, of course. I don't think it's genuine at all. I mean, I haven't, because, it's been so intense here. I haven't been closely following it. I've just been, and what's interesting is a lot of the terrorist channels on Telegram in particular have been sharing information about Georgia.
Okay, yeah.
And pro uprising. So that immediately I clicked, okay, right, this is connected. As is Ukraine, because of course Ukraine is now dipping into the northwest. And the funny thing is, a lot of the armed groups, I've noticed they're wearing bright yellow, Ukraine yellow ribbons around their arms to ident and around their helmets to identify themselves. So I've never seen that before from them, because Hezbollah has the yellow flag, so it's very unusual that they would use yellow.
Oh, it seems reminiscent.
That's just me, sort of,
seems reminiscent of the Israeli yellow pins.
That also,
but that's just an overlap. Who knows if that's the case or not?
But I mean, Ukraine Israel is a massive overlap anyway. So,
absolutely,
that's.
And we've talked about that, actually, about the possible long-term point about Zion, and there's a lot of these overlaps specifically with Ukraine. But so what I think is interesting with the Georgia part as well is that it could very well be like with Trump during his last administration. There was all these if not more than twice. It was, we're going to be out of Syria. That's my promise. And then, we're bound by the fact that we have to fight terror bad guys and we have to go back in because Assad carried out a gas attack. So I wonder if that might be how that plays out with Georgia. That this becomes, Russia did this here, now we can't leave, and that's why they rationalized why he didn't do that. That would make more sense to me. But I do see things shifting in very different ways today. So it wouldn't be surprising if they kind of rolled this out, as you said, that we knew Zelensky would eventually get thrown to the bus to rationalize some new step or to make them look good. But again, ending or not, however it ends, I think that's a good thing for Ukrainians in general. So I guess let's kind of put a cap on it here, because I do think this is important as its own topic. So where do you see this going in the long term? And we don't have to get into the depths of Gaza and because we've talked about that as well. But I just don't see how this comes to an end. Even as, I've never seen a more visible, proven, documented reality, whether it's about Gaza or other discussions coming from Israel and the United States and what they're doing. And yet it just keeps going. And now they've shifted into Syria as well. And so it's like, how do you see this kind of ending, and like whether there will ever be accountability, especially coming from a Syrian perspective?
I forgot about accountability, because I have absolutely zero faith in any kind of international law institutions. They've proven themselves to be utterly toothless and compromised and corrupt and under the control of the powers that are actually committing the crime. So, I've just put that out of my mind. For me, it's kind of different, I guess, because my perspective comes from living here. Right. So I'm very kind of immersed in the resistance culture. So I very much see it as being, there is no way to end the hegemony in this region unless you do it with power. And that is actually what President Assad said after his visit to Moscow on Friday. He said, this is the only way we can deal with this. It doesn't matter how you look at it. We're invaded by human waste, basically. You know, there's no other way to describe them when you look at how they treat prisoners, how they, I mean, you know, these are monsters that are supported by monsters in Israel, monsters in the US, monsters in Ukraine. You know, this is the point. Nazis in Ukraine, Zionists in Israel, Christian Zionists and Zionists in America and the UK and the EU and so on.
Mm-hmm.
They are their children, their spawn, right?
And as you point out, though, the interconnection between all of those, I see this as very much one thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, you know, like the only hope, honestly, that we have here in Syria or in Gaza or in Lebanon, and I'm saying that with full cognizance of the political shenanigans that are going on, the power that the US has to manipulate, to infiltrate, not only the US, but the UK and Israel, to manipulate and to infiltrate and to influence decisions within nation states, right? That's a given. But for example, now, we would never have seen this back in 2012, 2013, so on. That Iraq is mobilizing forces, and it is talking about coming into Syria, because initially we thought, yeah, they'll mobilize and they'll just protect the border between Syria and Iraq. But the news has kind of been increasing today that they are actually going to come into Syria to join the war. That's unprecedented. We've never seen that before. Yeah. Yemen. Right. You know, Yemen, I know, would send like tens of thousands tomorrow if needed.
Right.
So I think really we're heading for some kind of major conflict, because I can't quite see how it can be politically resolved. That doesn't mean that there doesn't exist some kind of solution.
Right. I sadly, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. I was just thinking out loud.
Yeah, well, it's just such a difficult position. I mean, look, my everything in my body wants to reject the, you know, just not that it's the reality of what has to happen, but the point that we have to respond with violence. You know, just like, it's not who I am, but it kills me. But that does seem to be where they have created this. So damn them for making this the reality of the situation, where you know, with all the evidence, if there was any justice so far, and who knows, like you said, maybe we'll see this go in a different direction. They've shown you, we don't care what you think. We don't care about the laws we put on everybody else. And so he's right. At the end of the day, that does come down to some kind of violence in response. And so what kills me about this, though, is that you can see how this goes. That this it's the same we see with like Russia and Israel or anybody else, where they can just relentlessly bomb Syria, do what they want. The moment somebody defends or responds, it becomes they're attacking their violence. And so I can't help but see that this will end up in the position that they've already lined out. It's Iran, right? And the moment they start responding, and I mean, let's not forget, the U.S. is illegally occupying Iraq. The U.S. is illegally occupying Syria. So the same argument applies to Palestine. They have the legal right to arm resistance, whether or not they were attacked. And so suddenly they start attacking, and the narrative spins out where the U.S. and they get the world war they've been pushing, you know, and I worry about that. But again, the fault would lie with the people that have manufactured this. But I hate to admit that does seem to be the only way they've left us. You know, there's no positive spin on that. That bothers me.
The only other thing that I could bring into it is how much does Trump want to go to war with China? You know,
what's that?
Because perhaps that, you know, he wants to clear the board so that he's freed up to target China. That's also kind of slightly in my head, because obviously they've been working through infiltrating Latin American countries, bringing in leaderships that are far right, allied with Israel, like what's his name, Milei in Argentina. Still Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil is still very much in their crosshairs. I mean, I've been speaking to the Venezuela ambassador here quite a lot about the situation, because he's actually originally Syrian, because there were many Syrians that moved to Latin America. And Venezuela knows that at some point America is going to seriously try and militarily, either by proxy or by intervention, destabilize Venezuela, because they've remained part of the resistance. And Maduro has, you know, foiled attempts to lead regime change coups in Venezuela at least twice. And of course, the control of like the Panama Canal, all of this waterway is also part of the war against China, right? Because China is starting to develop economic and trade relations with much of, let's say, the non-aligned Latin American countries.
Yeah, God forbid they should make mutually beneficial agreements with people that want to work with them. You know, it's crazy.
So, you know, it's kind of, I don't know, it's what I think is really interesting, and what maybe helps us in a way, is that all of the connections are coming much more to the surface.
Yes.
Yes. Which to a degree makes it easier to read. It doesn't make it easier to digest, but it makes it easier to read.
Yeah, and it sure as hell doesn't make it easier to stop, it seems. But I would say that's a very positive note. That's a good point to end on. That the positive note in there is very clearly that we're seeing this, right? That people out there are just seeing through it right now. And I think that's one of the reasons I point out a lot, that a lot of this stuff is trying to be kind of tied up and finished off and to drive us into, you know, what I see as the technocratic panopticon dynamic. But whatever you see them driving us into, I think it's about trying to get to a point to where it really doesn't matter anymore, that we see what's going on, you know. But I do think that's a very positive thing. I've never seen more people asking these questions and calling these things out. So I think that we need to try to capitalize on that and do our best as individuals to try to drive this into a positive, nonviolent outcome, whatever that might look like. You know, whether that's ICC, ICJ dynamics, but I'm not at the moment having a lot of hope about that. But I do see small moves, you know, so I'd like to believe that we can make that difference. I think your work and what you're highlighting for people is, as much as we're talking about things that are bad, objectively bad things, that it's giving people information to allow them to digest this and understand it. There's a level of comfort in that, like to know what is going on, even though it's still happening. So thank you for continuing to do this amazing work and fill us in on what's going on. And we have to connect again, you know, probably in the near future, as I don't think this is going to go away. So anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
No, I think you made a really good point, though. I think information enables us to find solid ground in the middle of the storm.
Yes, well said.
And social media is the storm. So I think finding that solid ground is incredibly important for people, you know, because that is what prevents that destabilization, that unsettling feeling, that feeling of panic, that feeling of kind of being out of control of everything. When you have that information, you're back in control. Yep. Because even if it's bad information, you know where it's heading, you know how you should prepare. Yeah. And I think the point you made is like really important. So
I agree. Well, thank you for taking the time, Vanessa. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I'll reach out as this goes forward, and I'm sure we'll connect again. I'm sure it's more to talk
about. Okay. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to your audience for always putting up with me.
They love you just as much as I do. So we'll leave it there. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.